Welcome to Community Watch, and today we have a very interesting story for you today. We're talking to Gary Mitchum Reeves, who you may have heard on an undisclosed podcast. We'll be talking to him in about Rome, so stay with us. Community Watch starts now.
Welcome to Community Watch. Greg, how are you?
Fine, brother. And yourself?
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah, we got a fist bump. We've been looking forward to today's show for quite a while and talking about it. I know that before myself even, you've been a fan of podcasts for quite a long time.
I just think podcast is just such an easy way to educate yourself. I mean, it's just so many genres and topics and so many people with interesting stories. And what better way than a podcast? You can listen to it while you're driving. You can listen to it while you're walking or exercising. I just think it's just one of the most convenient ways to educate yourself and entertain.
Well, we first heard about our guest today on the Undisclosed podcast, which both of us have listened to. And then he ended up having his own podcast. So we want to welcome him to the show, Gary Mitchum Reeves. Mr. Reeves, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor.
We're very happy to have you on Community Watch. And for the folks that have heard you either on Undisclosed or on your own podcast, which is called Mitchum, they know that you are a master storyteller. So we are kind of anticipating that, we may need to have you back on the show to share more of some of those stories with us. But for today, I want to try and introduce you to people who may not know you. You have, and Undisclosed, for folks who don't know, Undisclosed is a podcast that focuses on stories of individuals who usually are incarcerated, charged with crimes that they may not have committed. And the podcast kind of investigates those stories. And Mitchum, you have said all along that you were inappropriately convicted, wrongfully convicted of murder. You served some years for that crime, and you were paroled, and so you're and have been out of prison and for quite a long while now. But your mission is to clear your name.
Yes.
Have I got that right?
You got it. Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about your experience on Undisclosed and how you got connected, because your case on Undisclosed took up one of their seasons. It was a 10 episodes, as I recall, plus some kind of short episodes in between. And during that podcast, your story had some just amazing twists and what you had to go through. So tell us a little bit about the situation of you being connected to Undisclosed and doing that podcast?
Well, it excuse me, happened in 2016. There's 3 attorneys that do this show. Colin Miller is a law professor. Rabia Chadwick, Chadri, and Susan Simpson was investigating and doing a wrongful, what they believe was wrongfully convicted another guy from Floyd County, Rome, Georgia. They were working on his case. And his name was Joey Watkins, and they were working on him. And while doing that, my name kept popping up. So Susan finally just called me out of the blue. I kind of compare it to Mary Poppins dropping out of the sky, because nothing has not happened in my story since 2000. I think the last thing that happened was about 1997, 1998, somewhere in there was the last thing that had happened when I had been working trying to get the case reopened. I started in 1990 trying to do that, and I finally lost. So Susan she called and came to see me. She wanted to hear my story. Well, I have everything concerning my story. I've got every note, time, date, places. My sister kept up with that while we were trying to work on the case back in the day. It happened in 1974, and I was released in 1981 on parole, but then I got an administrative pardon in 1990. That's when I started working on my case, trying to get something done. So Susan was very interested. I showed her what we had, and they normally don't do any stories on people who are already out. They just work on people who are incarcerated. And I could understand that, but mine was a different story, and in the same county as Joy. So that's how it pretty well started. We started working on it in 2016. Susan and I worked together a year, putting the story together. And so she started investigating. I didn't know what a podcast was. Man, I had a flip phone. I didn't even have a smartphone. So I had to, we communicated a lot after she agreed to take the story on. We did a lot of texting, and we worked a lot late at night in the early morning because I don't sleep too well anyway. And I burned that little flip phone up trying to text with her. So I ended up getting a smartphone. And then the podcast started in July, and it went through 10 episodes. 10 episodes. And she pretty well summed out the story.
Let me ask this, because having listened to the podcast, your story involved a lot of different individuals. It was very complex, and it also followed a lot of what you had to endure during those years when you were incarcerated. But to anyone who was listening to the podcast, by the end of it, it was pretty clear that you were innocent of that crime.
Yes.
And there were witnesses, one that came forward, one that is still kind of a mystery. But the one that came forward was revealed, and I think as a surprise to you, in the last episode of Undisclosed, that made it pretty clear that you were innocent.
Yeah. All these years since the murder happened in 1974, and I had no memory the night the murder happened. I couldn't remember anything. Found out through Susan's investigation People who were in that house that night were caught in 1981 with another murder, and the pattern was pretty well close to this murder. They killed a guy up in Chatsworth. Well, maybe back up a minute. The GBI in 1981 said they had a witness in another case who told them that I wasn't there the night the murder happened. So I've been trying to remember something all these years that I couldn't remember. I wasn't there when it happened. So I'm trying to remember something I didn't actually see. So at the end of the podcast, they found this lady who knew the guy who actually did the murder and had killed 7, 8 other people, but was caught for the one that he was finally caught for. And he told her how he did the murder, why he did the murder. So we would listen to the podcast would come on every Monday, and my family would gather around and we would listen to things that she was learning. And so I heard that night for the first time in all those years what happened, who really did it. And it's very emotional. I mean, we all had it was an amazing thing. And I got people on that podcast that's listening to the story all over the world. I mean, we got people in Scotland, Ireland, all over the world that heard it with us. And I heard it with them for the first time. And I thought, well, maybe that will get something done. You know, maybe now the officials would do something. But as you know, we're still where we are.
Well, I know, and I think I've heard you say this. There seems to be less priority for a case that is, in many people's minds, history. You know, it's over. You are released. You're out, and have been for quite a while. It's just not a case that is a priority for a lot of people, but clearly it's important to you.
Very. And it's working on this case. I compare it to trying to push a Mack truck uphill when you're dealing with the judicial system. This is my opinion with the judicial system. Their mission in life is to protect themselves. And they're not going to admit anything that they were wrong on anything, especially a case this old. But if I was guilty of it, believe me, I wouldn't be going through all this stuff. Yeah. Interviews and things, that even what we're doing now, I wouldn't be going through it. So I know the public has a short memory. And after that interview that Susan did with this lady, I thought that would surely get something done, but it hasn't. I think about the only hope I've got is with the Pardon and Parole Board. They have the authority to give me a pardon for reason of innocence, and my record is classified. So if I could get that declassified, if I just knew somebody on the Pardon and Parole Board, you know, if I had a connection there, or if I knew somebody that did have somebody there, it's possible to get that declassified, and then we could see what the GBI had, the evidence they had in 1981.
Mr. Reeves, having listening to the podcast, I mean, I'm gonna be honest with you. It's the story in and of itself, and now that you're saying you wasn't there, makes more sense because the story is so complicated and confusing, but yet it's a real story. It's almost as, I mean, when you listen to it, if you didn't know it was real, you would think it was a book. It was a fictional book because there's so many moving pieces. Yeah. And so many, and even the things you were able to do while incarcerated, the moves you was able to make and the relationships. It's a fascinating story. And for me, growing up in this area, I was surprised that it happened in Rome. I mean, because you're talking about Maple Street and other places. I'm very familiar with those places, but I had never heard of your story. So in addition to you trying to clear your name, I think this is a story that needs to be known, at least here in Rome, in Floyd County. And the famous, I can't think of the lady's name.
Pegasus.
Yeah, Pegasus. I mean, those stories have just seemed to have disappeared from the history of Rome.
And I knew Peggy.
We need to take a break here, though, Greg. So that'll be a great way to lead into the next segment. So stay with us. We've got a lot more to come. It's a fascinating story. We'll be right back after this.
Your life is filled with opportunities to show the world you can take charge. It's waking up each day with a mission. It's working each day toward a goal. It's choosing to rise. It's charging forward with a purpose. It's changing the course of your life and taking charge of your future. If you're ready to be a Take Charger, enroll at Georgia Highlands College today.
Welcome back to Community Watch. We are having a conversation with Gary Mitchum Reeves, star of podcasts, actually featured on Undisclosed Podcast, but the star of his own podcast, Mitchum. And when we left at the break, Greg, you were asking about Rome being kind of also kind of a revelation in the podcast that we listen to.
Yes, growing up, I grew up not in Rome, right down the street in Somerville, but I've lived in Rome for a long time. And I was just thinking, when you listen to Mr. Reeves' podcast, it's clear the history of Rome that I guess that is discussed today. And some of the history of Rome that was colorful is not discussed. And I was just, in hearing his story, the fact that his story was not known. It was unknown to me, at least. And the other stories and the world that Mr. Reeves, that you lived in or you went in between in, seems like it has just been totally forgotten. And I can understand some of that, because some of that did involve a lot of corruption, as it appeared. But I just find it interesting that Rome has such an interesting history that it seems that it's no longer discussed.
The political arena in Rome at that time is a lot different than it is now. And the corruption. Rome was a dry county for liquor. So that made it wide open for bootleggers, and beer joints were here, but it was my world that I lived in. It was like the Old West. I mean, it was just wild place. And when that murder happened, the authorities had tunnel vision. They just looked right at me from the get-go. And we learned later that I had been drugged with Quaaludes and morphine. And well, if you heard the podcast, then you pretty well know what happened from there. But when I was arrested at my parents' house, when they came after me, and I woke up in the city jail the next morning with no memory. So they read a murder warrant off to me. They carried me to the old county jail at the sheriff's department. And I asked the deputy sheriff, I said, man, I have never been this sick. Could you give me something before you take me up? And his words to me were, the county can't afford to take you to the hospital. I didn't ask you to go to the hospital. I just asked for something for the stomach. And you're going to get the death penalty anyway. So that from there, that's the way the whole thing went the rest of the way. You're not innocent until proven guilty. You're guilty and proven innocent. Unfortunately, I didn't have the money for an attorney. And I've gotten off track with your question, haven't I? Sorry.
No, that's okay, though. That's okay, because that's interesting. Because I think that's part of it, though, is just the history of your story as it relates to, the surroundings at that time. I think it's something that we forget, that where we are today, we wasn't always at this place. But your story, I just find it very fascinating because it doesn't sound like something that could have taken place here when I was listening to it. That's how I just think it's so fascinating because the places you're describing, the home, the streets, it's like I know those places, which made it somewhat surreal. But I do want to get into another question. That is, where are you now, though? Because I know you're still fighting to clear your name. So what does that process look like now?
I'm back. This whole thing has been a hurry up and wait. And the last thing that happened was Undisclosed podcast, and it ended in 2017. The plan was they were going to try to go to the Pardon and Parole Board with this new evidence that they found and apply for a pardon for reason of innocence. That's on the back burner. Tell you the truth, I don't think there's anything happening. I think that's, unless I can find someone who knows someone at the Pardon and Parole Board and would go there for me. They went there, but they talked to an attorney, and they told the attorney what they had. The man who actually did the murder ended up going to prison for another murder and he died. He's dead. So they told Undisclosed, he's not there to defend himself. The Undisclosed has a witness that told them, he told her how he committed the murder, why he committed the murder, and they knew he committed other murders. I mean, these people were murder for hire. They killed 7, 8 people more after they killed in this murder. But yet he's not there to defend himself in this accusation of mine. So I don't really know where I am. I just keep trying to tell the story and get my story out there. And then my podcast, when these folks, Rob Gogi and Allison Lenora, started doing the Mitchum podcast, well, that kept the interest up there. And we have a lot of comments, and a lot of people want to help. What can they do? I don't really have an answer. I'm just kind of now, and I'm on hold again. Till I meet y'all.
You never know. You never know who is going to watch, community watch, and hear the story, and might be able to make a difference.
Yeah,
hope so.
That's hopeful.
Well, with the Undisclosed podcast, that focuses on primarily your case, although we do learn a lot about Rome and the world that you grew up in. But your own podcast, Mitchum, even though it does deal with the case, it also focuses just on your stories growing up, and you get a lot more of what you have called as Rome being the Wild West, which I don't think a lot of people understand when you say that, who are in Rome now and maybe weren't around back in I guess we're talking 60s, 70s. So if you could kind of explain a little bit, I mean, you told us that Floyd was a dry county, but that fact apparently led to a lot of criminal activity that you were familiar with. So if you could tell us just a little bit of that Wild Westness that Rome was in those days.
Yeah. Well, being a dry county, there were a lot of well-known bootleggers here. And they were certain officials on the take. In other words, if you want to operate here, and you could pay for protection, but my brothers and I, we were not in that category. My older brother came home from World War II, and as a small kid, he kind of got me involved in the moonshine business. That's what he was doing. So I got started in that when I was just a kid. Started out delivering. You had a lot of bootleggers in rural areas back then, and some of them would have a jukebox in the living room and a pinball machine on the front porch, and you would take them a few gallons of liquor at a time, and they were our customers. And then I graduated from that to running truckloads of moonshine up into Detroit. So I had been in that world, grew up in it all my life. It was, again, if you paid for protection, you were okay. They had the clubs here where the lawyers, the judges, they could go into that club and they could get a scotch on the rocks, and they were off. It was like going into a bar. But people who didn't in that world couldn't go in there. So if they wanted a bottle of scotch, we haul bonded liquor in here too, not just moonshine. So we provided for them.
But there were, even just for beer, there were a lot of, beer bars, and it was a much different time.
First beer joint I opened up of my own was down on 411 Cave Spring Road. Guy down there had a called Ray's Steakhouse, and he had dances there. He sold mixed drinks too, and but he paid for protection. So I opened up a little beer joint right next door, and had not been open long till a guy shot a guy in my place. And that it kind of went. When you have a shooting in one of these places, they're going to close you down eventually. So unfortunately, I got off to a bad start.
Well, we're gonna have to close it for this episode, but I think you've given us kind of a picture of things, and I hope you'll be willing to come back sometime and tell us some more stories about Rome and your own experiences.
Sure, be happy to.
All right, we're gonna
let me leave you with this. Most of the people look at Rome through rose-colored glasses. Okay.
Well, we're gonna have to cut it now, but thank you, and we'll have you back soon, and we'll see all the rest of you on Community Watch next time.